For years, we've spoken about the Gulf as if it were a single actor. One bloc, one voice, one strategy. But Yemen tells a different story. What we are witnessing today is not just a disagreement over a battlefield. It is a stress test of Gulf statecraft itself. Two close partners, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, aligned on many fronts, suddenly exposed by a very public divergence. Not through whispers, not through back channels, but through statements, airstrikes, and unmistakable signals. This matters because in a region this volatile, misunderstandings don't stay small for long. I want you to pause here and ask a deeper question. What happens when rising regional powers grow faster than the systems meant to manage their differences? This moment forces us to confront how power is exercised, communicated, and restrained in the Gulf today, and whether the region is evolving toward maturity or risking repetition of past fractures. If this kind of analysis helps you see the region more clearly, stay with me. Because to understand where this dispute leads, we first need to understand what the Gulf really is and what it is becoming. The Gulf Cooperation Council was built on an assumption that shared geography, shared threats, and shared identity would naturally produce shared strategy. But that assumption no longer holds. Each Gulf state today is pursuing its own version of regional leadership, calibrated to its size, ambition, and tolerance for risk. Saudi Arabia seeks strategic depth and security guarantees. The UAE prioritizes influence, access, and control over key nodes of power. Others move more cautiously, hedging rather than leading. These differences are not a failure. They are a sign of political maturation. The danger lies elsewhere in how these differences are managed. When threat perceptions diverge, when red lines are left unspoken, and when expectations are assumed rather than articulated, friction becomes inevitable. And in a fast-moving region, friction quickly turns public. This is why the recent dispute feels so unsettling. It exposes not hostility, but misalignment. Not rivalry, but the absence of clear rules. To see how the Gulf arrived at this moment, we need to step back into the region's recent history and the forces that reshaped its ambitions. The roots of today's tensions lie in a decade of transformation. Since the Arab Uprisings, the Gulf states have stopped behaving like cautious status quo powers. They began acting like architects of regional order. Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha in particular stepped forward, investing, mediating, intervening, shaping outcomes beyond their borders. This shift was driven by necessity. Traditional security umbrellas looked less reliable. Regional vacuums widened. Non-state actors gained ground. In response, Gulf capitals learned to move faster, think bigger, and act more independently. At times, this activism paid off. Diplomatic reintegration of fractured states, normalization with former adversaries, expanded influence in global energy, finance, and diplomacy. But activism without shared doctrine carries risks. Foreign policy became more personalized, decision-making compressed, coordination lagged behind ambition. And while visions for development were clearly articulated, visions for security often remained implicit. Yemen exposed this gap. What began as aligned objectives gradually diverged as priorities shifted and costs accumulated. The absence of openly defined red lines turned tactical differences into strategic confusion. This is the background against which the current dispute must be understood not as an anomaly, but as a predictable outcome of rapid regional ascendance. And that brings us to the first real breaking point. The breaking point came quietly then, all at once. Saudi airstrikes in southern Yemen were not just a military signal. They were a political message, public, unambiguous, and impossible to ignore. Shortly after, detailed official statements followed from both sides, laying out justifications, grievances, and competing interpretations of responsibility. This was new. Intra-Gulf disputes had always been managed discreetly. Phone calls, envoys, silence. This time, the disagreement unfolded in the open, not as an emotional outburst, but as a calculated exposure of differences. What made this moment dangerous was not the content of the dispute, but the clarity of the misalignment it revealed. Threats were being weighed differently, costs were being calculated differently, and red lines once assumed to be shared were no longer synchronized. Yet something else happened too. Despite the escalation, restraint held. The language was firm but measured. Actions were calibrated. Even as they disagreed over Yemen, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi continued cooperating elsewhere on Gaza, on regional diplomacy, on joint military exercises. This was crisis without collapse. And that tells us something important. The Gulf is not lacking alignment of interests. It is lacking alignment of explanations. If you want to understand why this matters far beyond Yemen, stay with me. Because the real story is not the clash you see, but the system beneath it. What sits beneath this dispute is not emotion. It is architecture. The Gulf's foreign policy system is still built for a different era, one where decisions flowed from personalities more than institutions, and alignment was assumed rather than codified. As ambitions expanded, that system stretched. Now, it is beginning to strain. When states do not clearly publish how they see the world, others are forced to guess. When threat perceptions evolve but are not communicated, partners act on outdated assumptions. And when red lines are left implicit, crossing them becomes easier and more costly. The recent exchange of official statements between Saudi Arabia and the UAE offers a rare glimpse into this hidden machinery. Each side sought not only to justify actions, but to explain its worldview, to define legitimacy, to signal limits. This kind of transparency is unusual in the Gulf, but it is revealing. It shows that disagreement itself is not the problem. The problem is disagreement without shared frameworks for managing it. Without institutionalized strategies, even close partners can misread each other's intentions. Not because trust is absent, but because clarity is. This is why Yemen matters beyond Yemen. It exposes the price of operating without openly articulated rules in a region moving at historic speed. And soon, that price becomes visible not just to elites, but to ordinary people. For ordinary people, these disputes are never abstract. They ripple outward, slowly at first, then all at once. When Gulf states disagree, markets hesitate, investments pause, security calculations shift, and for millions of people inside and beyond the region, the consequences show up as uncertainty, higher prices, delayed projects, prolonged conflicts that refuse to end. If you live in the Gulf, you feel this in quieter ways, in questions about stability, about opportunity, about whether long-term national visions can survive a region stuck in crisis mode. And if you live outside it, Yemen becomes another headline that never resolves. Another war that drags on because powerful actors cannot align not on goals, but on methods. This is why clarity matters. Transparent strategies do not prevent disagreement, but they prevent surprise. They reduce fear. They allow societies, not just leaders, to understand why risks are taken and where limits lie. You deserve to know how power is exercised in your name, and what lines will not be crossed. If this analysis resonates, take a moment, share it, stay engaged. Because what happens next depends on whether these lessons are absorbed or ignored. And the impact does not stop at the region's borders. What happens inside the Gulf never stays inside the Gulf. The region now sits at the intersection of global energy markets, maritime trade routes, and great power competition. When Gulf states signal uncertainty or disunity, the shockwaves travel fast. Oil prices react, shipping lanes tense, external powers recalibrate their presence. Last year alone, attacks linked to regional conflicts reached targets inside the Gulf itself. That was not just a security breach. It was a message. Instability invites projection. When internal coordination weakens, external actors test the edges. At the same time, the Gulf is no longer merely a security consumer. It is a diplomatic broker, a financial hub, a political swing actor between Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara. That role requires coherence. Fragmented signaling makes mediation harder. It complicates deterrence. It blurs who speaks for the region and on what terms. This is why bilateral coordination matters beyond symbolism. When Gulf states manage disputes transparently and institutionally, they project reliability. When they do not, others fill the gaps. The world is watching not Yemen alone, but whether the Gulf can govern its own disagreements. And that brings us to the hardest question of all. What comes next? The future now branches into three distinct paths. The first is convergence. Gulf states embrace transparency. They publish national security strategies. Red lines are articulated. Threat perceptions are shared. Disputes still occur, but they are contained, managed, and resolved before they escalate. In this scenario, Yemen becomes a lesson, a turning point. Statecraft matures, and the region gains the credibility needed to lead. The second is managed drift. Differences persist, but are handled pragmatically. Bilateral mechanisms absorb tension. Crises flare, then fade. Progress continues, but unevenly. Leadership is situational. Stability exists, but remains fragile, always vulnerable to miscalculation. The third path is fragmentation. Ambition outruns coordination. Transparency remains selective. Disputes go public more often. External actors exploit divisions. Conflicts harden. Transformation plans slow under the weight of insecurity. None of these futures is inevitable. They are choices shaped not by ideology, but by systems. History shows us this. Power without structure creates volatility. Structure without transparency creates mistrust. But when institutions catch up with ambition, regions stabilize. The Gulf stands at that inflection point, and how it chooses to manage disagreement will determine whether it becomes a rulemaker or remains a crisis manager. One final question remains. The Yemen dispute will not be the last test the Gulf faces, but it may be the most revealing. What this moment offers is rare, a chance to evolve before fracture becomes habit. The tools already exist: bilateral councils, coordination mechanisms, shared economic visions. What is missing is not capacity but candor, transparent strategies, clear mandates, institutional memory that survives leadership changes. These are not constraints on power. They are what make power durable. If Gulf states want to lead regionally and globally, they must first master the art of managing difference at home. Not through silence, not through escalation, but through rules, processes, and shared understanding. This is not about Yemen. It is about whether ambition is matched by architecture. If you want to keep exploring how regions rise, fracture, and redefine power in a changing world, stay with me. Share this conversation. Question assumptions, because the future of the Gulf will not be decided by one crisis. It will be decided by how many times the system learns before it breaks.